Picture this. You're at a fancy European dinner party in the 1600s. The host brings out the main course with a flourish, but instead of a roasted pig or peacock, it's ground up human remains. And everyone starts eating. You don't learn this in history classes out there. Yeah, you heard that right. For centuries, Europeans didn't just collect mummies. They ate them. Real, ancient Egyptian mummies, ground up and served as medicine, baked into bread, and even featured at luxury banquets. Now, you're probably thinking, hold up, why would anyone do that? Was it some twisted ritual? A bizarre status symbol? Or did they actually believe munching on millennia-old corpses would help them somehow? Well, stick around, because this story gets even weirder. We're about to dive into one of history's strangest health crazes, one that turned sacred Egyptian remains into a hot commodity across Europe. And just wait until you hear about the elite social gatherings where mummy meat was the star of the menu. Trust me, what these supposedly civilized Europeans did with ancient Egyptian remains will blow your mind. Let's rewind to the 1500s. Europe was going through what we call the Renaissance, and man, were things getting wild. Explorers were coming back from distant lands with stories that seemed too crazy to be true. But nothing, and I mean nothing, captured European imagination quite like ancient Egypt. Think of it like the ultimate flex of the Renaissance era. If you were anybody who wanted to be somebody, you needed Egyptian stuff in your collection. Statues, artifacts, and especially mummies. These weren't just seen as preserved bodies. They were status symbols, conversation pieces, and get this, potential miracle cures. The trade routes between Egypt and Europe weren't just carrying spices and silk anymore. They were shipping entire preserved human bodies across the Mediterranean. Mummies became such hot commodities that merchants would display them in their shop windows, like luxury items. Imagine walking down a street in London or Paris and seeing an ancient Egyptian corpse propped up next to fine silks and exotic spices. This obsession wasn't just some passing fad either. European nobility would host elaborate unwrapping parties where they'd invite their friends over to unwind a mummy, kind of like a modern-day unboxing video, but way more morbid. They'd gather around, sip wine, and watch as layers of ancient wrappings were peeled away to reveal the preserved person inside. You don't learn this in history classes out there. The craziest part? These weren't just collector's items gathering dust on rich people's shelves. Apothecaries would stock mummy parts right next to their herbs and medicines. Artists would use a paint colour called mummy brown, made from actual ground-up mummies. Even Shakespeare got in on the action, mentioning mummy as a medicine in his plays. This wasn't some underground black market. This was mainstream European culture at its finest. But here's where things get really interesting. These weren't just exotic curiosities anymore. Europeans had much bigger plans for these ancient remains. They were about to turn sacred artifacts into something you'd find in a medieval medicine cabinet. And trust me, what they did next is even more shocking. So how exactly did someone wake up one day and think, you know what would make a great medicine? Ground up mummies. Well, it all started with a massive misunderstanding about bitumen. You know, that black, tar-like natural substance. Ancient Arabic medical texts praised the healing properties of bitumen, which they called mumia. Here's the wild part. Because Egyptian mummies were black and shiny, Europeans thought they were preserved with this magical healing bitumen. But hold up, it gets better. These European doctors came up with this absolutely bonkers theory called sympathetic medicine. The basic idea? Dead, preserved tissue could somehow transfer its preservation powers to living tissue. In their minds, consuming mummy bits was like taking an immortality pill. I mean, these mummies lasted thousands of years, right? Clearly they knew something about preserving human flesh. And we're not talking about some back alley quack medicine here. The biggest names in European medicine were all about that mummy life. The personal physician of Francis I of France prescribed mummy powder. King Charles II of England had his own personal recipe for king's drops that included human skull and mummy extract. Even the famous philosopher Francis Bacon praised mummy medicine as a cure-all. You don't learn this in history classes out there. Want to know what they thought mummies could cure? Pretty much everything. Headaches, bruises, broken bones, nausea, epilepsy, plague, internal bleeding, you name it. They had a mummy prescription for it. They'd mix mummy powder into tinctures, pack it into pills, dissolve it in liquids, and even make plasters to put on wounds. Some doctors would prescribe mummy wine Yes, that's exactly what it sounds like. Wine with dissolved mummy bits. The really mind-blowing part? This wasn't some short-lived fad. This practice went on for centuries. Medical textbooks from the 12th to the 18th century regularly included mummy preparations in their prescriptions. They were so common that you could walk into pretty much any European pharmacy and ask for prepared mummy like you'd ask for aspirin today. But here's the kicker. Remember how this all started with a mix-up about bitumen? Well, actual ancient Egyptians didn't even use bitumen in their mummification process. They used natron salt and plant resins, so Europeans spent centuries eating mummies because they misunderstood an Arabic word. Talk about a lost in translation moment. When demand for mummy medicine exploded across Europe, it created one of history's weirdest supply chains. Egyptian tombs became the new gold mines. Teams of grave robbers would raid burial sites, sometimes bringing out dozens of mummies in a single night. They'd sell them to merchants, who'd pack them onto ships bound for European ports like cattle. These merchants weren't exactly careful with their cargo either. They'd often break mummies into smaller pieces to fit more into their shipping crates. Think of it like ancient Egyptian Tetris, but way more disturbing. But here's where things get really dark. As demand kept growing, suppliers couldn't dig up mummies fast enough, so they got creative. Some started making fresh mummies from recently deceased bodies. They'd take corpses from hospitals or execution grounds, treat them with bitumen and spices, wrap them up, and presto, authentic Egyptian mummies ready for market. You don't learn this in history classes out there. The mummy market had something for everyone. Rich folks could buy entire mummies to display in their homes, while middle-class customers might pick up small pieces or powders from their local pharmacy. Some merchants even set up mummy grinding stations right in their shops. Choose your mummy, watch it get ground up, take it home fresh. And just like any luxury market, there were different grades of product. Top-shelf mummies were supposedly from ancient Egyptian royalty. Spoiler alert, they usually weren't. Mid-range options might be labelled as priest class or noble mummies. Budget shoppers could get common mummy powder, which, let's be honest, was probably just regular corpse dust with some exotic spices mixed in. The whole trade was so profitable that by the 1600s, Egypt was practically running out of mummies. We're talking about thousands of ancient bodies, dug up and shipped off to be eaten by Europeans. Makes you wonder how many priceless archaeological treasures ended up in someone's medicine cabinet. Just when you thought this story couldn't get any weirder, enter the mummy banquets. Yeah, you heard that right. Actual dinner parties where the main attraction was eating mummies. You don't learn this in history classes out there. Picture this. It's 1680s France. You're at a high society gathering. The host is showing off their wealth and worldliness by serving mummy meat. Guests are passing around plates of flesh that's been carefully extracted from Egyptian remains, seasoned, and prepared like some kind of ancient delicacy. They're washing it down with wine mixed with mummy powder, snacking on bread baked with ground mummy, and even sweetening their drinks with mummy-infused sugar. It was like a macabre farm-to-table movement, except the farm was a tomb, and the table was set with 1,000-year-old human remains. But the aristocracy didn't stop at eating mummies. They got creative. Some would host mummy painting parties, where artists would use that infamous mummy brown pigment to paint portraits of the guests. Others would organise mummy unwrapping ceremonies, turning the desecration of ancient remains into a fashionable social event. The really mind-bending part? These weren't considered shocking or taboo practices at the time. European nobility saw mummies as exotic commodities, not human remains. They'd casually discuss the best ways to prepare mummy meat like they were trading cooking tips. Some hosts would even brag about the vintage of their mummy, claiming it came from an ancient pharaoh or priest. The practice got so extreme that by the mid-1700s, some European doctors were prescribing specific cuts of mummy for different ailments. They claimed the head was best for headaches, the heart for cardiac issues, and the feet for foot problems. Rich patients could special order these specific parts, while common folks had to make do with generic mummy powder. And if you're wondering if anyone at the time thought this was just maybe a bit messed up, there were a few voices of reason. One Arabic physician, Abd al-Latif al-Baghdadi, visited Egypt in the 12th century and was horrified to learn that Europeans were eating mummies. He wrote that it was a barbaric practice unworthy of civilized people. Talk about being ahead of your time. So, what finally made Europeans stop eating mummies? Well, it wasn't a sudden light bulb moment. More like a slow realization that maybe, just maybe, eating ancient human remains wasn't the best medical practice. First crack in mummy medicine's reputation came from an unlikely source: tomb raiders themselves. By the 1700s, they started admitting that most of their ancient Egyptian mummies were actually homemade fakes. Nothing kills a luxury market quite like finding out you've been eating recently deceased criminals instead of ancient pharaohs. Then came the age of scientific thinking. Doctors started doing crazy things like actually testing if medicines worked. Revolutionary, right? They began questioning traditional remedies. And wouldn't you know it, there wasn't much evidence that eating ground-up mummies cured anything except maybe an appetite. But the real death blow to the mummy-eating trend came from a growing interest in actual Egyptian history. As scholars started studying hieroglyphs and learning about ancient Egyptian culture, they made a shocking discovery. These mummies were people, like actual people, with names and stories and beliefs about the afterlife. European attitudes shifted dramatically. Those same social circles that once hosted mummy tasting parties now considered it barbaric. Museums started collecting and preserving mummies instead of grinding them up. By the late 1800s, eating mummies had gone from high-class medicine to something people pretended they'd never been involved with. The tragic part? By the time Europe developed this conscience, countless mummies had already been destroyed. We're talking about an entire chunk of human history, ground up and consumed because of a centuries-long medical fad. Some estimates suggest that the Europeans went through hundreds of thousands of mummies during this period. This weird chapter in European history left us with more than just some seriously disturbed archaeologists. For starters, it completely changed how we approach ancient artifacts. These days, museums have strict rules about handling human remains. And yeah, don't eat them is definitely on that list. The whole mummy-eating episode is a perfect example of what happens when we treat ancient cultures as curiosities instead of actual civilizations. It also shows us how easily common knowledge can be dead wrong. For centuries, the brightest minds in Europe swore by mummy medicine. The next time someone tells you everybody knows something, remember that everybody once knew that eating mummies was good for your health. It's easy to look back and think, wow, those people were crazy. But remember, they weren't monsters. They were just people trying to solve problems with the knowledge they had. Sure, that knowledge was completely wrong, but they genuinely believed mummy medicine could save lives, sometimes literally betting their lives on it. The real lesson here isn't just don't eat mummies. Though seriously, don't eat mummies. It's about how even the smartest people can believe some pretty wild things when those beliefs get wrapped up in tradition and authority. Next time you're sick and reach for whatever trendy new supplement is making the rounds on social media, maybe spare a thought for those Europeans and their mummy medicine. After all, at least your miracle cure isn't made from ancient human remains, right?